give us a bit of orientation, just some bit of introduction, because these were some of the questions that were being raised in the comment section on registration. There was some discussion about why is this study necessary, and your question will be answered in these first 2 slides. Just to give some background about the study, we do know that Indigenous people possess very invaluable knowledge. And these are very much embedded within the cultural and spiritual values of the land. And what we noticed was Indigenous people had a very strong connection to the land that they are often based in, and they know it very well. They have, as we said, cultural and spiritual values. So this kind of Indigenous knowledge it's very context-based. And so they may know things that people who are not from the area may not know. However, even despite this kind of invaluable knowledge, Indigenous knowledge has often been marginalized within mainstream research and even the development paradigms. So this is also very timely, these grants for us to study this area, because not much attention has been paid to this nexus of Indigenous knowledge as well as a gendered perspective on the same. So this is where our rationale for the project came in. We believe that there are existing knowledge gaps on how to strengthen these knowledge production systems, especially around East and Southern Africa. And being able to recognize this perspective and the contributions of Indigenous peoples within the area is really, really timely. So our project has really identified these gaps and opportunities, and we will talk more about that as we move along. So just to reorient us on the research objectives, we aimed to map and analyze the main actors within Indigenous knowledge production systems within East and Southern Africa, especially as it regards to inclusive development. We also aimed to identify initiatives and local research organizations which are either led by or participate with Indigenous scholars and communities, including the key research themes. We also wanted to establish how gender concerns are integrated and into these thematic research areas, and what are the Indigenous knowledge production systems that integrate gender or concern gender. So this was the second objective. Lastly, we wanted to identify key gaps and future opportunities and pathways for us to strengthen Indigenous knowledge production and processes in East and Southern Africa. So just a little bit about those research gaps. Many of the seminal works on Indigenous knowledge have often stemmed from the global north. And even if we can be even more specific, we find a lot of work around in Canada and New Zealand. There's a lot of work which has been done by Maori people of New Zealand. Bishop has done a lot of work on that. Tufwai Smith has done a lot of work. But at the same time, there's not much work that's stemming from Africa. And the little that there is from Southern Africa. So a very seminal work from Chilsa Bagele on Indigenous research methods, Indigenous knowledge productions. Those are the ones that have come out. So there are still a lot of gaps in terms of knowledge around Indigenous research from the East African context. So there's much work to be done there. And then also Indigenous research often attributes their own cultural values to the research process. So if that's the case, we'll see this work coming from Canada and New Zealand will have a very much contextual lens, which may not extend sometimes to the Eastern African context. So we can still see a lot of gap and a lot of work to be done. So given this emphasis, it's really important to look into East African culture, Indigenous knowledge, and employing these cultural relevant examples in Indigenous research. So ultimately, there's need for more work from Eastern African Indigenous people. So we've talked about that, and we've talked about even the studies from New Zealand. And even when we think about it, these studies don't often apply a gendered lens to research, to Indigenous research methodologies. It's often a very gender neutral approach. So gender is not really factored in. It's just gender neutral. So this is another gap as we move ahead to think about how we can use a gendered lens to Indigenous research methodologies. So this is a significant gap, and there's more work in terms of looking at East African Indigenous ways, women's ways of knowing, and therefore providing a holistic and gender responsive perspective on Indigenous research approaches in Africa. So I will just talk very briefly about what are the issues with applying traditional methodologies to research. And this is just to frame the approach that we took to this study. So you will notice that even with researchers who are coming to do Indigenous research or are collecting Indigenous knowledge, they often will apply traditional research methodologies. However, this often fails to capture Indigenous knowledge systems. And furthermore, it presents sometimes power imbalances, given that hierarchy of the researcher and, dare we say, the researched, with that kind of power imbalance. And then also, even within the work itself, researchers and academic institutions often control research data and dissemination. So Indigenous communities are often left out of this dissemination and even the research data that they provided. So this, of course, presents imbalances and can even lead to cultural appropriation and exploitation. So it is within this context that we applied a different type of methodology. So we used a post-colonial Indigenous research approach as advanced by Chilsa Bagele. It was informed by gender and post-colonial theories, which entailed the very active participation of Indigenous people in the research process, as well as using their stories, their cultural knowledge, and their experiences in the data collection process, and using that to build up the report. So this really informed our tools and our approach. The first was having a mapping tool where we mapped out the key actors. We used this to have an Excel sheet just to be able to know the lay of the land. And from this sheet, we used it to have a first inception meeting where it was a very good dialogue to talk about our research and work through it with the people identified in this mapping. Then from there, we refined our data collection tools even further. We decided to have some key informant interviews, and we identified, I think, about five areas: Kajiado, Narok, Laikipia, Nakuru, and Nairobi. Then we also had some talking circles, which we really used to be able to have that Indigenous approach. So we had three talking circles in each county, one for women, one for men, and one for young people, where there were 8 participants each in these talking circles, and they talked about the process of Indigenous knowledge in their community. They talked about what role they, as either older men or women or young people, what role that they played in Indigenous knowledge. So it was really fruitful. The talking circles were started either with a proverb or a song or some form of way of connecting with the community. So this methodology really played to that post-colonial Indigenous approach that we talked about. So we also did some desk review, which also informed our report. And then we also had convenings where we were trying to really counter those traditional research methodologies, really bringing what we had learned, like a show and tell. We've done this, showing to the community and talking about it. So we had one in the inception report on the 6th of February. Then we had a validation workshop with all the Indigenous researchers and community members, and also some academics and people who are involved in Indigenous knowledge. And then today as well, we have this regional seminar to be able to disseminate the results and be able to share and discuss a dialogue of the study. So these convenings were also very key in terms of our Indigenous approach, Indigenous research approach. So just some very high-level reflections on the fieldwork. As Patrick indicated, we were really an Indigenous-led research. Myself as an Indigenous person, and then also most of the research associates were people from the community, but also Indigenous people themselves. And then we also took a gender-sensitive approach. We had a mix of male and female research associates to be able to talk to the communities as best they would be able to relate, and having that same gender would be able to bring rapport and also to be able to have a seamless discussion. So this Indigenous-led gender-sensitive approach really helped with eliciting the best research results as possible. Some few limitations. It was sometimes challenging in some communities to find youth and also even key officials for culture or at the county level. So it was a real challenge, and this is something when we're going forward, we need to really think about how to involve county officials, because as we come to know, culture really lies within the county mandates. So this is something to think about even as we move forward in terms of strengthening the policy discussions and discourses. Again, given it's a scoping study, it was really positive because it gave us a chance to look in many areas, but also at the same time, given the timings and it's a short term, we were not able to achieve as much as we could, but this is part of research, and all these things can be put into the future research directions. So without further ado, I'll just move into the introduction of key findings. I will talk in high level, and then maybe we can get into some of the details of this as we move along. So one of the key findings we found was that Indigenous knowledge was not uniformly distributed or even valued across genders. What do I mean by that? We found that the way that women's knowledge, or what was considered women's Indigenous knowledge, was perceived differently and had a different domain in comparison to their male counterparts. And same with youth, and even same with persons with disability. So it was very much segmented and different values associated to the different genders. So what we also found in this was that the traditional scholarship tended to really focus on very visible areas which were male dominated, such as hunting, warfare, and governance. The softer sides which were associated with women, such as medicine, maternal health care, those were less valued and less prominent. So this was one thing that was very, very key. The findings also revealed some very distinct, yet they were also interconnected, roles of men, women, and youth in the production and preservation, as well as transmission of Indigenous knowledge. So for example, women were in one area that was associated with health, with maternal health care, with certain herbs, certain cultural rites of passage, but those could not also go on without women being involved. So it was very interesting, this interconnection. And men the same. Men were involved in certain rites of passage, which involved transmission of knowledge to young people, which was very critical. And so it could not take place if men are not there or if the youth are not there. So it was very interconnected, which was an interesting finding. There were also specific barriers and opportunities which were related to each group and gender, as well as age group. So when we think about it, given a lot of the communities that we saw, the Maasai, Endorois, these are communities that are very reliant on the age set system. So it is not a surprise that it was tied to age set and also gender. So this was something that came out quite strongly in the findings. So let's move to the role of women in Indigenous knowledge. A key finding here, and I've already alluded to it, is that gender dimensions of knowledge was evident across all the research sites that we visited. What we did notice were women were acknowledged as very key custodians of Indigenous knowledge, especially in these areas like herbal medicine, food preparation, food security, childcare, and cultural rituals. So they were known as very, very key. In some communities, women were even involved together with county governments as birth care attendants, partnering with hospitals. So this was very, very key. They are acknowledged and their role is emerging, but there's a need for that strengthening of this role. However, despite that informal or the acknowledgement, let's use that word, despite this acknowledgement of their critical role, they were not really visible in terms of Indigenous knowledge leadership or even the decision-making roles. So this kind of left them out on the outside looking in because their knowledge remained unrecognized or even underutilized in terms of public policy or in public forums. So it's a catch-22 here, if you will, that yes, women are acknowledged as custodians of Indigenous culture, Indigenous knowledge rather, and in those areas of medicine, herbal medicine, food security, childcare, and cultural rituals, but they don't have this recognition. So this remains a challenge and a key gap. We'll move on to the role of men in Indigenous knowledge, and I have begun to allude to it, but the research data shows that men have historically served as the key primary custodians and transmitter of Indigenous knowledge systems, and their contribution is more visible and often associated with Indigenous knowledge and cultural identity. So if we look at even the way that there are several books on Indigenous knowledge, it's often men who have this visibility. So we see books by people like from in the Maasai community, Reverend Baye, but not that many from women. I think so far it is from a seminal work by Naomi Kipuri on the oral literature of the Maasai. So there's still a huge gap in defining or carving out that gap for women. So men, as we could see from the research, occupied roles as rainmakers. They were often as detecting early warning signs for drought or floods, rains. They also occupied key roles as peacemakers, peace brokers. When there were land or boundary disputes, they were involved in that, and even in their resolution and resolution of any issues to do with conflict. They were also astrologers and healers and key herbalists. So these were the real key roles for men. And often, even in those cultural rites, they usually were involved in terms of ceremonial instruction and in some storytelling sessions. So through this, men ensured that historical narratives, key information about that in the Indigenous people, moral teachings, and key cultural values were transmitted to younger people during these cultural rites. And this role is very, very important in terms of maintaining continuity, cultural continuity, especially given what is happening, globalization, modernization, urbanization. This role is very, very key. So to summarize this, men had what would be perceived as more varied roles in Indigenous knowledge than women and what we'll see with youth. So that's one key finding. And they were more accepted as authorities on Indigenous knowledge. Although they were similar to women in that they had no established platforms for capturing or preserving this knowledge, they were more accepted than their women counterparts. So I'll move into people with disabilities and then to youth. One key finding we found was persons with disabilities were very much absent from Indigenous knowledge systems across communities. And this was sometimes referred to because of the oral or physical nature of traditional knowledge practices, such as singing, dancing during rites of passage, and depending on the disability, persons with disability would not be able to take part. So it rendered them maybe accessible to much of these practices. And then also, given sometimes the belief systems of Indigenous communities, persons with disabilities would be set aside or would be hidden from the rest of the community. So they were not able to take part because of this marginalization. Although this is slightly changing, despite their marginalization, now some persons with disability are trying to assert their rights to participate. And we found some organizations such as the Narok Albinism Association and the Northern Range Trust, which are creating more inclusive programs that recognize the unique perspectives of persons with disabilities and what they bring to the Indigenous knowledge systems. When it came to youth and Indigenous knowledge, we found a very, very fundamental gap. And this is something possibly needs to be really looked at. We found that youth engagement was really critical gap. This was because of the perception that youth had around Indigenous knowledge. It was sometimes seen as backward or not fashionable, not relevant. And so the youth stayed away from this area. And this is a challenge because if it continues in this way, there's going to be a real threat to intergenerational transmission of Indigenous knowledge. Some of the factors that participants or interviewees cited was formal schooling, whereas youth are away for a long period of time, even in boarding facilities. So they were away from their Indigenous communities. So they didn't have a chance to take part or to engage in some of the Indigenous knowledge production. So this was cited as a very key factor. Also, spiritual, the emergence of Christianity going to, religion. This was also cited as a barrier because sometimes the religious perception and Indigenous knowledge were not aligning. So these were the two key factors in this. Something else that emerged was technology. The key finding here was that technology could be seen as a double-edged sword. While it was a very key way of being able to capture the knowledge and Indigenous knowledge and put it all in one place, it was also some sort of wildcard in that it was an unknown factor, both in terms of structurally and infrastructurally. The communities might not, were in remote areas where internet and electricity may have presented a challenge, but there was also a gray area in terms of ownership. Who owns this knowledge if we put it on a particular platform? Who owns it? Who controls it? This was very much a big challenge. And also, are we having this information, putting it all together? Could it be that there might be some exploitation that could occur? Could somebody use it for commercial purposes? These were some of the issues that were raised. And also the fact that there were a lot of policy gaps around this technology use. It was not clear if there were any policy implications around this. but also in general, policy gaps around exploitation of Indigenous knowledge and products. This was a key gray area. Okay. So I'll just move into the recommendations, and we have recommendations for different sectors. So a key recommendation from government from these key findings was that there was really a need to, some counties did have cultural policies, but they were not implemented. Some did not have these cultural policies. So there was really a need to have this uniform development and implementation of the national and county level policies that really recognize and protect Indigenous knowledge. This was really key. There was also need to integrate Indigenous knowledge into formal education. Given the key finding we found from the youth about being away and formal education being seen as a barrier towards Indigenous knowledge transmission, it would be best to have this integration into formal education and curricula, especially given the CBC curriculum, which allows for this kind of alignment. It would be good to have that alignment, especially at primary and secondary as well as tertiary levels, so that it's seamless. Young people have been engaging with Indigenous knowledge from even early childhood centers or even primary. So it's not a big leap when it's something that's talked about in the tertiary level. So especially for those communities that have Indigenous people, it would be really good to have this kind of integration. Again, something about these legal frameworks, it was really important to enact and implement these legal frameworks to protect Indigenous knowledge from exploitation, and also safeguard the cultural expressions, symbols, and traditional product from unauthorized use. For CSOs, there was really a very key recommendation about promoting community-owned and benefit-sharing models of research, where findings are able to be returned to communities and to help them to improve their local well-being. It was also important to train and support Indigenous youth, women, and persons with disability in terms of documentation and even digital tools, and having some mentorship programs that could link elders with youth to be able to bridge these intergenerational knowledge gaps. Because some of these perceptions that the young people were having was that, what is the relevance of this? Is it just, it's something for older people? How does it affect our lives? So having this linkage so that young people can identify and resonate with Indigenous knowledge was really important. There was also need to advocate for greater visibility of Indigenous knowledge, especially in national development agendas and donor priorities. This one is really key because that's the way that Indigenous knowledge can have this greater visibility and meaningfulness and cultural relevance for the communities. Lastly, there was a need to document Indigenous knowledge, especially in local languages, by using very diverse formats like video, audio, pictorials, and written texts. For academia, there was a real strong recommendation to adopt very participatory and Indigenous approaches in their research frameworks, those that really center Indigenous voices and challenge some of these power imbalances that I alluded to in the beginning of my discussion. To also establish protocols for returning research findings or going back to research, the communities that have undergone this research, to be able to go back to them and involve them in it, and to use accessible formats and even languages. This one was really key and very important. Also, to encourage researchers to co-publish or co-author with the Indigenous collaborators so that they are not just left out and they feel like they were part of the data collection process and just left there. This was something that came out very strongly. It was also important to strengthen the capacity of local leaders and researchers as they possess better cultural and linguistic understanding for effective engagement and documentation. It's also important to facilitate cross-regional and comparative studies on Indigenous knowledge between East and Southern Africa, led by local scholars. And I think Martha has also alluded to this, that there's that initiative to have the some sort of cross-learning between Canada and also researchers from Africa. So this is part of that recommendation as well. I think that is it. One thing that we got in our validation workshop was that, and it alludes to number 3, encouraging the co-publishing and co-authoring of work with Indigenous collaborators. Someone mentioned that there's an Indigenous man who has been helping people with scholars from the global north with, I think it was livestock rearing practices. And these scholars have gone on to become, finish their PhDs. They have gone on to be lecturers, professors even, yet the same Indigenous person is still the same. So I think it came out very strongly that there's need to help acknowledge and to better these communities, not just leaving them how they found them or even worse. So the last recommendation is to donors, ensuring prioritization of funding for Indigenous communities and scholars. And I think Martha has alluded to this as well with the cross-learning work that, or call for proposals that is out. Supporting efforts to convert Indigenous knowledge into community-owned economic value. So looking at things like ecotourism, the package and sale of herbal products or even traditional crafts, and acknowledging those communities for that. Also requiring grantees to demonstrate how they have benefited the communities involved and promoted shared learning platforms. So this is quite important given what came out in the validation workshop about some Indigenous people who are just, left the same while others in academia are benefiting from that knowledge. Encouraging also the development of common platforms and networks for collaboration among Indigenous communities and academia, as well as policymakers and NGOs, to reduce the duplication of efforts and facilitate some shared learning. So I think I will end it there. So I'll hand over back to